Vampire movies are a genre on their own, and like vampires, the genre just won't die. The Last Voyage of the Demeter is a surprisingly fresh take on Dracula and could have brought back another wave of vampire popularity. Vampire movies have transcended the generations, but there was one generation where vampire movies didn't suck. You've entered the Gen Experience. I'm Victor, and there was no shortage of vampires during Gen X. Plenty of piss-poor B-grade schlock was released, but you can't deny some of the most original blood-sucking ever offered came from that era. Unlike the undead, the Demeter looks dead in the box office waters. Although an original take, it just can't compare to the vampire and Dracula films that blazed a trail for the future. These ain't no Twilight. Let's take a look. Let's begin small. The small screen, that is. Dan Curtis took his struggling black and white afternoon drama to new levels of ratings highs when he added some gothic twists, starting with the arrival of Barnabas Collins on the 1960s Dark Shadows. This loosely based Dracula storyline played well within the confines of the family central to the plot and allowed for a slew of supernatural cliffhangers for soap fans racing home every day to catch their favorite vampire villain. But it wasn't the TV show that stands out as much as its attempts on the big screen in 1970. Somewhat rehashing the story shown in the series, House of Dark Shadows transitioned the actors to cinemas for a creepy Halloween haunt you'll want to check out. Barnabas's baggage comes equipped with the usual lost love from centuries before, now inhabiting a modern beauty, as well as his own Renfield and the often abused familiar Willie Loomis. But his arrival also brings a wealth of typical horror tropes, from witchcraft to lycanthropy. And on a side note, the Johnny Depp movie is based on the show, not the other way around. But the weekday soap boasted originality no other drama could deliver. If you like to learn more about Dark Shadows, you can, right here on my channel. Soap opera to board game, how a TV vampire joined family game night. I'll leave a link in the description. I couldn't feature some of the most important vampire tales of Gen X without Blackula. Yes, Blackula. This 70s film delivered pure blaxploitation and released to mixed reviews. However, Blackula was one of the top-grossing films of the year. Not simply a retelling, but incorporating our main man, Count Dracula, refusing to help an African prince suppress the slave trade, then punishes him by first turning him undead and then imprisoning him until his escape in modern times. Well, 1972 modern, of course. One of the most original vampire tales, this film not only offers a villain who the whole population can get behind, but mirrored all the groovy goodness of the era, including those badass sideburns. The 70s brought us two main features, one on the small and the other on the big screen. In 1974, Dan Curtis of Dark Shadows fame, who was either obsessed with vampires or wouldn't stop trying until he got it right, produced a possible winner with this TV movie starring the famous Jack Palance as the titular Count of Darkness for CBS. Palance may not be everyone's cup of tea in the role. Many believe the cowboy was miscast, while others loved the sense of rage his Dracula demonstrated instead of the usual controlled, calm killer. Given a theatrical release for Europe, more gore was permitted than included in the censored TV broadcast, but sadly, it remained one of the most sexless versions of the grim tale. To be fair, Palance wasn't on any list of the 10 sexiest stars. Although Jack Palance's likeness was used in the Marvel series Tomb of Dracula, the film is remembered by few. Now, if you were a certain age in 1979, then you were most likely, moved by Frank Langella as the Count in the major motion picture titled simply Dracula that year. It followed much of the same beats as Universal's 1931 legendary hit, as well as the stage production from the 20s. But here, the striking romance novel cover young actor played the role both with seduction and devilish apathy, cursed to be alone for eternity. Powerful but suave, the monster still moved gracefully through mists, still driven for blood to survive, but increasingly and uncontrollably romantic. The movie poster even came with a tagline, Dracula, a love story. This vampire outing decides to take the sex up a notch, with actual emotional connection and a love affair more sincere rather than carnal and cruel. Frank, undoubtedly one of the most erotic counts featured in the role, who would go on to infamously play Skeletor, understood that the attraction the character produced among women was key to realize his enormous sexual prowess, which Langella did not hesitate to use. Still in 1979, a completely horrific remake of 1922's silent movie Nosferatu was released. The sheer lack of humanity depicted in the Count's visage is part of the unease we feel while watching this terrifying creature prey on his victims. With no real scares, but intense feelings of dread, like Frank Langella's turn as the Count, this movie dwells a lot on the main character's loneliness and is a slow and methodical, intense journey of the ferocious monster. Surprisingly, this epic film spent time showing the crossing on the ship, as in the new movie The Last Voyage of the Demeter. It shows the crew's demise one by one, being made to look as though they were victims of the plague. To this day, the visuals and sparse dialogue from the famed Werner Herzog provides nightmare fuel, no matter how long in the tooth the story took to tell. Who rubbed his lamp? Robin Williams' Genie, he is not. Barlow may not be Dracula, but he is the vampire in a TV miniseries, Salem's Lot, from the 1970s, where the miniseries was born. Based on Stephen King's second novel, this TV movie had endless eerie and unforgettable moments. Lest we forget the dead boys scratching to get in. Oh. This two-parter, also from 1979, kept us on our toes just waiting with plenty of anxiety-inducing moments, but the climax and Big Blue's appearance caught everyone off guard. The makeup, resembling a blue-pallid Nosferatu, is intense, but a pause and look will reveal the glaring application shortcomings, resulting in just one close-up. But even with subpar cosmetics, we all looked out our bedroom windows that night with a little more caution. The classic actor James Mason portrays Barlow's familiar, Straker, a competent day dweller taking care of business before the arrival of his master. This theme would be revisited in the 80s, but was an effectively more striking take on the bug-eating Renfield character depicted in the original Dracula story. 1979 was a good year for our famous fiend, and last up we have not just a comedy, but a parody. With a gothic and tragic love story, a frightening horror, and a TV miniseries behind it, the vampire genre had one hell of a transfusion. With this success, why not end the decade with your favorite pain in the neck about to bite your funny bone? No, I didn't write that. It was the official tagline for Love at First Bite, starring George Hamilton, the OG George Hamilton, before he was replaced with a plastic facsimile. This wisecracking take on the original story found an audience and was a financial success, ending the year as the 13th top-grossing film. Filled with airplane-style comedic scenarios like blood banks, sex clubs, and discotheques to foil our dandy Dracula pursuing what else but the reincarnation of his lost love, Mina Harker, this movie couldn't lose. Were you a fan of this film? When comparing to the newest Dracula big screen outing, a couple of these 70s vampire stories do prove a unique take on an old horror icon staple. Which of them showed the most originality? Love at First Bite was one of the first comedies to take on Count Dracula and offers plenty of original content. Was that a hint of what's to come? Let's find out, as the 80s were coming in hot with a new sensibility, starting with the David Bowie-led The Hunger. Far from gothic terror, this modern tale of vampires in New York City shifts the blood-sucking into soft tones and alternative lifestyles found blossoming in the 1980s. New and thought-provoking subliminal messages gave us disturbing concepts, both poignant and uncomforting. Bowie was joined by Susan Sarandon and featured homosexual eroticism with famed French model and actress Catherine Deneuve. Nothing blatant or hardcore, but seamless and sensical. The cast are professionals and sell a film that plays like an independent, bittersweet tale of forbidden love between the undead and those who must die to keep her immortal. This remarkable 1983 version of vampire lore is too thrilling to miss, so don't hesitate to watch. Increasing the 80s vampire aesthetic 2 years later, we trade intense, mature passion and regret of The Hunger for teenage lust and even more edge-of-your-seat thrills. The original Fright Night of 1985 is an homage to TV's Salem's Lot for anyone paying attention. In a tighter storyline with more scares than its predecessor, it follows the same line, including having a seemingly mortal familiar taking care of business for head vampire Jerry during the day, and by the look of things, perhaps by night too. The vampire hunter trope dares to go less Van Helsing and more late-night horror host with Roddy McDowall. Makeup and surprising effects add to this frightening treat, including an indelible memory of horror in the vampire Amy reveal. Played by Amanda Burst, this unsettling moment and the rest of the atmospheric tone were relatively underrated at the time of release, but first found fame in videotape rental. The visuals and pacing of this good old-fashioned scary movie in the rad 80s overshadow any questionable acting or silly premises the characters might find themselves in. And speaking of silly, we can't have the 1980s without a good dose of sex comedies. Comedy was a genre that seemed not only out of place, but almost sacrilege to Brahms' character and novel. However, it was no holds barred in 1985, and with Fright Night giving the scares, Once Bitten with Lauren Hutton would deliver the laughs, albeit all sexual innuendo based. Perhaps there were some fleeting and biting moments of humor in the films prior to this romp, but an all-out farce was not expected. Not a winner at the box office, but being an early Jim Carrey vehicle, it has since earned some level of respect. Lauren Hutton is a great foil to the comic superstar, and it co-stars Cleavon Little of Blazing Saddles fame, so you should probably check it out. As the late 80s were dawning, so was the departure from full-on camp, but not the melodrama. These Lost Boys might be able to fly, and they may never grow up, but Peter Pan is certainly not their leader. This is. These deadly night dwellers look the 80s rock star part as they hunt the boardwalk on the shores of Santa Carla in Southern California. Although the great actors like Diane Wiest, Kiefer Sutherland, and Bernard Herrmann provide some light humor, it was only meant to offer depth to the characters and to situations that at its core are very dark. Lore was on full display, with vampire rules being spelled out throughout the film through the large cast. This relatively gritty tale delivers a perfect balance of 80s bold fashion, the growing anti-hero, and just a touch of deeper meaning to create a story you can't help but love. The plot, the performances, and some shocking action moments make The Lost Boys a classic. Oh, and let's not forget the amazing soundtrack. Let's end the 80s with a 1988 black comedy. No, we're not talking about Blackula again, but a comedy that is not all goofiness, but darker, mysterious, and simply odd. This is another vampire film, but quite original. It stars Nicolas Cage. Enough said. It's hard to explain, and perhaps you should just judge for yourself when you watch the movie to really decide whether or not Nicolas's yuppie character Peter has actually become a vampire, or is slowly losing his mind to a point where he resigns himself to acting like one in the only ways he knows how. There are many soft spots in this film that are meant to keep it sensitive, while it continues to be off-putting by the antics of an obviously deranged main character. Many key scenes are depicted as both reality and fantasy, and along with Peter's visits to his psychiatrist, the viewer must determine if what is going on is real and if we are actually in a vampire movie at all. Could this be the most original vampire film yet? You tell me. Either way, it's in a class of its own. As we creep into the 1990s, Gen Xers were growing up, but these titles appeared while some of the youngest of the generation were still in their prime ages of influence. We felt more of the sinister and realistic dangers with The Hunger, The Lost Boys, and Fright Night, but we hadn't yet seen how dark it could get. But first, the cheerleader destined to be a vampire hunter. She may not have slayed audiences in her first outing, however, the moderate success of Buffy the Vampire Slayer the movie in 1992 allowed the writer Joss Whedon to take the story into a direction he had intended 5 years later. The film comedy did star greats like Rutger Hauer, Donald Sutherland, Paul Reubens, and Luke Perry, but unfortunately the film is remembered for the more raw, edgier, action-packed, and even better written in comedy high-stakes Buffy TV show that debuted in 1997. With Clueless still 3 years away, Buffy the movie was just a little ahead of its time. Vampires have proven to incite laughter in the past, but they are best served with a heaping helping of violent horror and some sinister side dishes. Gen X would deliver with a pair of what are considered by many to be the quintessential vampire films of our era. The exotic locales, the personal and destructive premise of meeting and accepting your maker, the payment for your decisions, along with the homoerotic subtext and beautiful actors set in front of gorgeous sets and costumes, gave audiences something they had never imagined. A world that sexualized, moralized, and demonized all it was to be a vampire, even when you don't have a choice. Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire starts and ends with thrilling twists and introduces the world to who are now considered iconic pop cultural characters, the foppish Lestat and the brooding sexy Louis. The author did not feel Tom Cruise fit the part, and as it was no Mission Impossible, Tom also questioned the direction. But he sold it with every melodramatic scene dripping with disdain. Brad Pitt and Kirsten Dunst's transformations had us breathless as we endured what those who are not prepared for what it is like to be undead have to come to grips with. The surprises around every turn, the blood-filled killing sprees, and the first time the very sexual vampire character is largely seen in male-on-male blood-sucking. Not to mention the palpable tension between Louis and Antonio Banderas' Armand. Christian Slater adds another layer to this pensive and haunting tale of vampires in New Orleans. It is fitting we end with the retelling of Bram Stoker's famed book, the one that started it all, Dracula, but the 1992 version. This film is considered by many the ultimate tribute to the tale and most accurate novel translated to screen. Taking stylish liberties, Francis Ford Coppola's epic Dracula stars the impeccable Gary Oldman as the Count, and seamlessly ties the true story of Vlad the Impaler to our famed fictitious vampire so realistically, we the audience can no longer decipher what is fantasy and what is reality when it comes to the timeless lore. This film actually makes the ocean crossing more than a cliff note, as Coppola tries to include the pivotal moment now in the spotlight of a modern-day Dracula big-budget feature. However, it was more important to catch up with the lead once in London and continue his search for Winona Ryder's Mina and his lust for blood through vicious atrocities that made this movie as epic as it was. Sadly, The Last Voyage of the Demeter ends its opening weekend with only $6.5 million. That's considered a flop in today's rush for satisfaction. There are great reviews, and I believe it might still be worth a watch. It may be a great story, as well as it might be riddled with the usual unrealistic CGI and overdose of low-key lighting techniques to complain about. Who knows? It still might be a good scare. Like some of the best movies about our vampire villains, where VHS and video rentals grew a following, creating success where once there was no hope for a financial gain, this movie may grow in a cult status via streaming services. After being reminded of the great vampire films that defined a generation and inspired those that followed, which do you remember most fondly? Did you see the new Dracula movie, and did you like its original take on just that one chapter of the book? I mean, we all know how it ends, right? There are countless vampire films throughout history. We didn't even touch on the famous Hammer films of the UK. Many are worth a watch, notwithstanding the technicolor blood of bright red fingernail polish. There are even the exploitation films of the 70s, where more lurid stories of vampires and vampire hunters were told, only with a lot more skin. A lot. Speaking of so many stories, look around this channel and you'll find some fantastic shows in the Gen Experience, like this one. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Thank you for your support, because pressing subscribe means this won't be my last voyage. Don't forget to show me some love with a like, and until next time,